The young woman in today's case was 24, full of hope, and navigating the ups and downs of young adulthood like so many of us. She had a loving family, a job she was proud of, and big dreams for her future. But in the search for connection, something we all crave, she took a chance on someone she met on Tinder, someone that she thought she could trust. What began as an ordinary November evening would spark a mystery that gripped an entire community and left everyone asking, how could something so unthinkable happen to someone so full of life? Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and if you've never been here before, I'm Kimbyrleigha. It's nice to finally meet you. I'm always so excited to take you on a journey to a new place every single time I tell one of these stories. And speaking of taking you on a journey, today's sponsor is June's Journey. It's the perfect blend of captivating murder mystery and hidden object puzzle solving. I've been playing June's Journey for a while now, and it's become one of my go-to ways to unwind. It's a free-to-download mobile game set in the 1920s, where you play as June Parker, who's determined to uncover the truth behind her sister Claire's murder. You'll use your observation skills to find clues, gather evidence, and uncover secret family drama, all while enjoying a beautifully crafted storyline. They even sent me a cute little thank you package for the new year with a figurine of June inside and some yummy chocolates. To play the game, you search for items that propel the mystery forward. Each discovery unlocks more chapters and more surprises. You can play by yourself or join a club and tackle special competitions for in-game rewards. You can also decorate your very own island estate, and mine is coming along pretty nicely, I have to say. Whether you're taking a break from work or you just need a fun mental challenge, June's Journey offers a quick escape and keeps your mind sharp at the same time. It's free to download on Android, iOS, and PC. Just click the link below in the description box or scan the QR code on the screen to start solving mysteries with June's Journey today. And a huge thank you to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video. Partnerships like these and also your loyal viewership means so much, and it helps create these videos and make them possible. So now let's get into the video for today. Before I introduce you to Sydney, I want to tell you a bit about how her parents got together. Sydney's dad, George, was a Nebraska guy through and through. He grew up there, soaking in all that friendly, small town atmosphere. And right after high school, he took off for a brief adventure in Seattle. But after about a year, he realized home was calling him back. So he returned to Nebraska and got serious about his education, enrolling at Wayne State University to study physical education. Now, the best part is that during his time at Wayne State, he met this incredible woman named Susie, and they really hit it off. And by June 25th, 1983, they were saying their vows at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Osmond, Nebraska. After George wrapped up his undergraduate studies, he went on to earn a master's degree in school administration from the University of Nebraska, Kearney in 1991. And then they decided to start building their life together. They moved to Holcomb, Kansas, where George landed a job at a company called IBP, and this was a big meatpacking company. They spent a few years there, well, 3 years, and then they felt it was time to head back home to Nebraska, settling in a place called Arcadia. George jumped right into the community life, becoming a K-12 principal. He was pretty busy at the time. And family was a big deal to George and Susie. They ended up having 3 kids, Levi, Sydney, and Mackenzie. Sydney, the middle child, was born on August 21st, 1993, in the small town of Broken Bow. And that is how the family started to take shape. Rooted in Nebraska, built on education, community, and the love that George and Susie found back when they were just 2 college students falling for one another. When Sydney was just a little kid, you could already tell that she had a big heart and a real drive to do the right thing. It was like she was born wanting to make people's lives better. In the year 2000, when she was about 7 years old, her family decided to pack up and move to Neely, Nebraska, because her dad, George, landed a job as a principal at the local junior high school. He was super involved, coaching football, teaching driver's ed, you name it. And Sydney kind of grew up in that environment of community and helping out. So it's no wonder she liked to help herself. At first, Sydney could be a little shy around somebody new, but once she warmed up, her personality just came out. She was bursting with energy, and she had an unforgettable, huge smile. Everyone noticed how friendly she was, especially new kids who might have felt nervous at first. Sydney made sure to make everyone feel included from day one. She was the kind of person who made you feel like you belonged, no matter what. Her best friend, Brooklyn McChrystal, described her as loyal, dependable, genuine, witty, and hardworking. That's a lot of big compliments, but they fit Sydney perfectly. Brooklyn said that Sydney's laugh was something you would never forget. It would start off as a giggle, and then it would turn into this hilarious cackle, and before you knew it, she had you laughing so hard that you couldn't even breathe. Sense of humor was a huge part of who she was. Sydney loved so many things, it was hard to even count them all. She liked doing puzzles, she had her favorite TV shows, but truthfully, the outdoors was where she really came alive. Whether it was climbing in a tree, just feeling the rush of freedom from high above, or hopping on her bike and exploring the world around her. She always found ways to enjoy nature. Swimming was fun for her and her siblings as well. And then when winter rolled around, sledding was what her family loved to do. In the fall and spring, she would take an ATV for a spin and soak up all of the changing seasons. But the ultimate love of her life, it was fishing. She was absolutely hooked, pun intended, and Sydney would jump at any opportunity to go fishing with her dad and her brother Levi. She would try to tag along on even the boys-only father-son camping trips. She didn't want to miss out on reeling in the catch of the day. Sydney could basically outfish pretty much anyone in her family, and she wore that talent proudly. While she might have appreciated some girly things now and then, nothing topped the thrill of fishing and the joy that it brought to her. Sydney pretty much worshipped her older brother Levi when they were growing up. If Levi was into something, Sydney would be into it too, except for one thing, the Los Angeles Lakers. When Kobe Bryant, may he rest in peace, and the Lakers were dominating, Sydney loved to poke fun at Levi's team, and she couldn't help just teasing him about his basketball idol. It wasn't in mean spirit either. It was more like, sibling rivalry. But funny enough, as time went on, the roles reversed. Sydney ended up needing Levi's help more than ever because she had this habit of forgetting to fill up her car's gas tank. I know many of us have been there. And this happened more than once. She would get stuck somewhere on the side of the road and she would have Levi come help her out every time. One time her car died literally right across the street from Levi's house. And without hesitating, he came and towed her car and saved the day. He didn't give her a lecture. He didn't do the I told you so. And it was moments like that it was clear that even if they joked around a lot, deep down, they always had each other's backs. Holidays were a big deal to Sydney, especially Christmas. When she was younger, she spent Christmas Eve night in Levi's room, and this was a little tradition that continued even after their younger sister Mackenzie was born. Once Mackenzie joined the family, the holiday magic only got brighter for Sydney and her siblings. As they got older, Sydney and Mackenzie became inseparable. Whether they were going to parties together or checking out local parks or just hanging out, the two of them were best friends. They were the classic small-town sisters, cruising around with friends, blasting their favorite songs, and soaking up every bit of fun they could find. It was the kind of life where simple moments became cherished memories, and Sydney never missed a chance to share them with her siblings. Sydney had a total soft spot for animals as well. It was almost impossible for her to pass up the chance to bring home a new furry friend. I know I can relate to that, and many of you can too. So when she spotted a $20 kitten for sale on Craigslist, she didn't hesitate. She called up a friend, she hitched a ride, and soon enough, she was face to face with this tiny little ball of fluff that instantly stole her heart. Sydney scooped the kitten right up, snuggling her close, and named her Nimsy, an adorable choice that matched the cat's playful, mischievous vibe. Taking care of Nimsy became one of Sydney's little passions. She was always coming up with clever ways to make the cat's life happy and easier, like rigging a waterer right next to a faucet so that Nimsy never had to bother with the basic old bowls ever again. It was just classic Sydney. She was always thinking outside the box. When she was a kid, she had a blast every summer with her cousin Paige Folkers. Paige would fly in from Washington, and they would get together and run around outside, getting into who knows what. They were partners in crime, always down for the next adventure. Paige remembered one time that Sydney tried towing her with a scooter using a rope. It started off as a fun thrill ride until Sydney wiped out, and then she sent Paige flying, and Paige ended up scraped up from head to toe. Even though it was a pretty rough crash, what stuck with Paige the most wasn't the pain, but Sydney's immediate reaction. She didn't think twice. She scooped Paige up and sprinted home, showing off that fierce protective streak that she was known for. Sydney's quick thinking came through in other scary moments too, like the time her little sister Mackenzie started choking on a piece of hard candy. Without missing a beat, Sydney jumped into action and did the Heimlich maneuver, saving Mackenzie's life. It was one of those moments that truly captured who Sydney was at her core. She was caring, brave, and always ready to help. Over the years, life pulled Sydney and her favorite cousin Paige in many different directions, and the in-person visits drifted off. But still, they kept in touch with each other online, posting on Facebook, Instagram, and of course, a lot of people's favorites, especially if they're younger, Snapchat. And it wasn't the same as hanging out and going on wild scooter rides, but it let them stay connected and cheer each other on from afar. High school can be a tricky time for anyone. Her grades were always solid, and she had this quiet confidence about her, and people respected that. Sydney was more than just a good student, though. She threw herself into just about every opportunity that came her way. Sports were a huge part of her life. Basketball, volleyball, golf, you name it. She gave it her best shot. She even helped out behind the scenes, helping keep stats for other teams and making sure that everyone got the credit they deserved. On top of all that, Sydney showed her creative side by joining the band and even taking part in her school's acting performances. Sydney was basically a one-woman school spirit machine, and she did it all without making it look like a chore. Of course, having her dad double as her basketball coach meant that Sydney's home life and school life overlapped more than most teens would be able to tolerate. But she took it in stride, probably because sports felt like second nature to her. Early on, it was clear that she had a natural gift for athletics. Unfortunately, life doesn't always stick to our plans. In her teens, Sydney was diagnosed with scoliosis, and that changed everything. Suddenly, her dreams of pushing herself further in sports hit a roadblock. The pain could be brutal, especially when she tried swinging a golf club, something that she used to love so much. What's really special about Sydney, though, was how she handled this hurdle. It was frustrating and heartbreaking to feel that her future in sports would just slip away. But instead of throwing in the towel, she adapted. Sydney stayed involved. She explored her other talents and kept cheering on her classmates from the sidelines if that's what it took. And that resilience was just part of who she was. Someone who didn't let a setback define her, but instead found new ways to shine. Sydney was definitely a free spirit, and you could see that in her tattoos that she wore proudly on her body. Each one of them was more than just ink. Each one of them had a story about her and her passions or a moment in her life. One of the most striking tattoos she had was a yin-yang symbol on her forearm. It wasn't just some random design either. It represented the balance of light and shadows within her, maybe within all of us, reflecting the complex layers to her personality. On the inside of her wrist, Sydney had the word believe, a constant reminder to stay positive no matter what life threw her way. But the tattoo that really held a piece of her heart was the one on her right bicep. It was lyrics from her favorite song, Wonderful, by Everclear. Everything will be wonderful someday. Those words were a beacon of hope for her, a mantra that kept her going even in tough times. And tragically, those same words will become a bittersweet reminder of everything Sydney dreamed of and the life that she wanted to live, but wouldn't get the chance to. Not everything will be wonderful. As sad as that is, it's the truth. After graduating from high school, Sydney chose a practical route and she dove right into the retail world. She got a job at Menards, which is a home improvement store, and it had expanded across the Midwest and the Northwest. Her first job at Menards was in the Norfolk, Nebraska location, but wasn't long before she transferred to the store in Lincoln, about 3 hours away from her home in Neely, where her family lived. She was ready for the next chapter in her life: independence, living on her own, and a little more excitement that city life had to offer. Sydney's new apartment in Lincoln wasn't just about her escaping the small town life. It was a chance to build her own space, both physically and mentally. It didn't hurt that her little sister Mackenzie and her brother weren't too far away either. They would often spend quiet evenings together, making dinner and watching their favorite Netflix shows. Sydney was a big fan of keeping things easy, so much so that she even paid Mackenzie, her little sister, to clean up when they were done visiting because, let's face it, cleaning wasn't exactly Sydney's favorite thing. It's not mine either, so I can relate. Despite the physical distance between Neely and Lincoln, Susie, Sydney's mom, made it a point to visit her daughter as much as possible. They would go on mother-daughter outings to places like Euphoria, which is located at 41st and O Street in Lincoln. It's unlike any other shop, a magical little store filled with crystals and jewels that Sydney had become enchanted with. Her absolute favorite was the amethyst. The purple stone was known for its calming properties, making it the perfect match for Sydney, who struggled with anxiety and depression. Purple had always been her favorite color for as long as she could remember, and Sydney's crystal collection didn't stop at amethyst. She also was drawn to quartz crystals, which were believed to have healing powers for both physical and emotional healing. Whenever she felt bogged down by her struggles, she'd dive into her collection, sorting, reorganizing, and reconnecting with her inner self as she examined the stones, each one bringing her a moment of reassurance, a small bit of peace in a chaotic world around her, even if it was for just 8 seconds. All of these details, her tattoos, her move, her family bonds, and her love for crystals, I wanted to tell you these things so that you could really picture who Sydney truly was, a creative soul, an independent spirit, and a person who found significance and comfort in the world around her. Even at Menards, Sydney was more than just a friendly coworker. She was the type of person that everyone looked forward to seeing when they clocked in. Her team got to see her genuine smile every day, and they quickly realized that Sydney wasn't just another employee. She truly cared. She was a friend. When she got her first bonus, you could practically see the pride just radiating off of her. It was clear that she took pride in not only her job, but in being able to maintain a positive attitude and make a difference at work. But Sydney's kindness went way beyond just the store's walls. She had this incredible ability to make people feel seen and supported. In early 2017, one of her coworkers was dealing with some pretty rough living conditions, and Sydney didn't hesitate. She opened up her apartment, giving him a place to crash until he got back on track. It was just one of those quiet, compassionate gestures that showed who Sydney really was at her core. And even though she was good at her job and happy enough in retail, Sydney had way bigger dreams. She even told her sister Mackenzie about wanting to work with animals, ideally as a veterans assistant dog trainer or something along those lines, something that she felt could help others but also dedicate her time to animals. She would fantasize about moving off to Colorado or maybe somewhere down south where she imagined life would be calmer and more in tune with nature. But when it came down to it, she just couldn't picture leaving her family behind in Nebraska. They meant way too much to her. In fall of 2017, Sydney's cousin Paige, who was still living out in Washington, tried to convince her to come out west. Paige was married and settled down, and she knew that Sydney loved the outdoors and thought she would fit right in with the breathtaking scenery near Mount Rainier. She invited Sydney to come visit, hoping that once Sydney saw the lush green forest, the mountain views, and the laid-back Pacific Northwest vibe, she might decide to pack up and start fresh there. For Paige, it was less about convincing Sydney to move away from Nebraska and more about showing her what the world had to offer, a chance for her to explore somewhere new, breathe different air, and find new opportunities. Mostly, though, Paige just really wanted to reconnect with Sydney, to share their time together. But it seemed like Sydney wasn't ready to commit just yet. Sydney was a bit stuck in her routine, which isn't a bad thing. And speaking of routines, Sydney had a nightly routine that was like clockwork. Around 10:30 every night, she would shoot her mom a text just to say goodnight. It was a small thing, but it showed how connected she was to her family, even when she wasn't right there under their roof. Weekends often meant a drive from Lincoln back to Neely to visit her parents, and that second weekend in November of 2017 was no different. On November 10th, Sydney headed home, and once she got there, she opened up to Susie about something that had been weighing on her mind. She was really worried that the medication that she'd been taking for anxiety and depression just wasn't doing its job anymore. Her mom was always ready to help, and she called and set up a doctor's appointment for the following Monday, November 13th, to see what they could do and get Sydney to feel better. Come Sunday, it was time to head back into Lincoln so they could be ready for that doctor's visit. Sydney hopped into her Dodge Nitro with Susie, while her dad George followed behind in his truck. When they got to Sydney's apartment, her parents did what supportive parents do. They pitched in, helping clean up the place a bit and making sure her fridge and cupboards were not running low. They wanted her to feel comfortable and cared for, especially with everything she was going through. They were really caring parents. And the next day, Monday, November 13th, the three of them headed to that doctor's appointment as planned. After the appointment, Susie and George made sure to grab Sydney's updated prescription on the way back. And once they dropped her off at her apartment, they said their goodbyes and headed home to Neely in their truck, probably feeling a little more at ease, knowing that steps were being taken to help Sydney feel better. It was just another example of how this family worked as a team, always looking out for one another. At 24, Sydney was like a lot of people her age, just trying to find a real connection with herself and with someone else that understood her. She was starting to explore online dating apps, hoping that maybe her perfect match was just a swipe away. So back on November 11th, she actually matched with a woman who went by the name Audrey. From their very first messages, things seemed pretty laid back and a lot of fun. Something new, something that Sydney could find an escape in. She was excited, and Sydney introduced herself, mentioning she was originally from Neely, but now lived in Lincoln. The girls talked about all kinds of casual stuff, from how much they both love cannabis to their favorite comfort foods like black-eyed peas and cornbread. It wasn't anything too serious, just two people seeing if they clicked, with Sydney exploring her feelings. And by November 13th, Sydney and Audrey were already talking about meeting up in person. Audrey asked for Sydney's address so she could figure out how long it would take her to drive over. And meanwhile, Sydney had just started on those new medications for her anxiety and depression. And she told her mom, Susie, the next day on November 14th, that she was feeling hopeful that these medicines would make her feel better, a lot better. Susie was beyond relieved to hear that. And that same night, November 14th, Audrey came to pick Sydney up from her apartment. They cruised around Lincoln, smoking and chatting, getting to know one another in a relaxed, no-pressure kind of way. By the end of the night, Audrey dropped Sydney back off at her place and even texted her, "Good night, gorgeous." It sounded like a pretty promising first date, something to look forward to, and possibly lift Sydney's mood. I think most of us have felt that feeling, the rush of something new, the excitement of meeting someone you like. And right after Audrey left, Sydney checked her phone and saw messages from her childhood friend Brittany Flynn, who she hadn't replied to yet. Sydney was excited, so she quickly shot Brittany a text, apologizing for being MIA and explaining that she had been on a date with someone she met on Tinder. She spilled the details and said that Audrey was 25, super cute, and they had just driven around town. Sydney even sent a few photos of Audrey to Brittany, showing off this new person who caught her attention. She was happy that it wasn't just another boring date. And as if that weren't enough, Sydney was still full of those same good vibes when she reached out to her work best friend, Tara, telling her all about the super cute girl that she just hung out with. It was one of those nights where Sydney's optimism really shone through. The kind of moment where you can practically feel the butterflies fly from your stomach out into the air. And Wednesday, November 15th felt like a turning point for Sydney. She texted Tara that morning, mentioning she'd be working her usual noon to 6 p.m. shift at Menards. With the holiday coming up, Tara hinted that Sydney could stick around a little longer if she wanted to. But Sydney had something else on her mind, another night out with Audrey. This time, though, Sydney made it clear that she was navigating with caution. She confided in her friend Tara about a lingering worry she had. Too many times before, she had matched with a woman who turned out to be part of a couple just looking for a third, and she'd been burned and disappointed in the past. She wanted no part of that again. No three-ways, no surprises, just something real that she could count on. Sydney was hoping that Audrey was truly on her own, someone honestly interested in getting to know her, not just passing the time. And that is a frustrating part of dating apps like Tinder, the whole bait and switch type of thing. And her friend Tara was very protective. And that protective streak kicked in, and she encouraged Sydney to double-check Audrey's situation to make absolutely sure this wasn't another setup. Audrey reassured Sydney. She said she didn't have anyone who really got her, who would listen to her and could connect with her, so it seemed like a good sign. But Sydney knew better not to trust too easily. She learned that no matter how promising things seemed, caution was a must. And later that day, Sydney and Audrey's messages were all about their plans, meeting at 7 p.m., driving around town, smoking a little bit of pot, and just talking together. It sounded fun. They even talked about maybe doing a little casino run on the weekend if the vibe was right. It all sounded exciting and spontaneous, exactly the kind of thing that Sydney was yearning for. Before heading out, Sydney took a moment to snap a quick selfie for Snapchat, showing off her outfit for the night. A white jacket and a cream-colored shirt. She looked confident, ready for whatever the evening might bring. Her mom, Susie, saw that post, and she immediately felt a little worried. Sydney had never mentioned going out on a date when they talked earlier. So concerned, Susie screenshot the snap and texted her daughter, asking what was up with this? Why had she kept quiet about this date? But Sydney never answered. Now, the silence on the other end of the phone would soon feel heavier than anyone could have imagined. But at first, it was just the typical behavior for a 24-year-old who was independent and having a good time. But in the days leading up to all of this, Susie had been worried about Sydney's mental health. She tried calling her daughter a number of times, but she hadn't answered. And at first, her mom just brushed it off. The holidays were almost there, and they had plans. Thanksgiving dinner in Omaha with family on the 23rd, and Sydney was excited about it. She even mentioned that after dinner, she was going to head back in time for her Black Friday shift at Menards. It all sounded normal, so Susie wasn't immediately alarmed when Sydney went quiet. But the next day, on November 16th, a Thursday, people started to realize something was off. Sydney never showed up for her shift at Menards. And anyone who knew Sydney knew that was not like her at all. She was the type to let you know if she couldn't make it. She wouldn't just not come in and not say a word. Her coworkers were unsettled, and the worry quickly spread. Back in Neely, Susie's concern that she hadn't heard from Sydney had shifted into something heavier. Sydney hadn't spoken to her since Wednesday afternoon, and she just knew that something was wrong. It wasn't like her daughter being this distant, or maybe she was struggling with her mental health. But this just felt odd. It felt scarier to her for some reason. But Susie was busy that day. She was in the kitchen, making hors d'oeuvres for an event that she had planned that night. But her mind just kept drifting. Where was Sydney? With every minute that passed, Susie's gut feeling grew stronger and more apparent. It was like it was a warning that something was truly wrong. Later the same day, that worry spread among Sydney's coworkers. It turned into alarm. They reached out to her sister Mackenzie, explaining that Sydney hadn't shown up for her shift, hadn't called in, and now she wasn't answering any messages or calls. The fact that Sydney, who was usually so responsible and considerate, had just gone silent was like a punch in the gut. Mackenzie immediately told her parents, Susie and George, about what was going on, and by this point, Susie's heart sank. She had been worried before, but now that Sydney's friends couldn't reach her either, the fear took a whole new weight. And within hours, Susie and George hopped in their car and made that long, anxious drive from Neely to Lincoln, nearly 3 hours of imagining all of the worst possibilities. They were desperate for a sign that Sydney was okay. When Sydney's parents and sister arrived in Lincoln on Friday, November 17th, the scene at Sydney's apartment only deepened their dread. There was Sydney's car, sitting right in the driveway, and it just felt all wrong. If Sydney were out and about, why would her car still be there? Where was she? They went so far as to alert the local police, and they met them at Sydney's apartment for a welfare check. They went inside with the officers, hoping that they would find a clue that would put their mind at ease. Instead, they found Sydney's cat Nimsy, left without food or water. And anyone who knew Sydney knew that she adored her cat. She would have never left Nimsy uncared for, not in a million years. The apartment was eerily quiet. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, but her phone, her wallet, and her keys were all missing. It felt like she had just stepped out for a moment and then vanished into thin air. In that silence, the realization hit them all. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. Something terrible had happened. Back at Menards, Tara was struggling with her own sense of dread. She kept thinking any minute Sydney would show up with some kind of wild story or at least a text to say she was safe. But as more time slipped by, Tara's heart sank more and more. She tried to hang on to hope, but it was slipping through her fingers. As for Susie, she found herself facing every parent's worst nightmare. She didn't know how to begin searching for her daughter. She turned to prayer and the support of their tight-knit community in Neely. Neighbors and friends rallied around them, offering comfort, anything they could. It was a small spark of light in their world that had suddenly just gone dark. Within days, Sydney's disappearance rippled through the community, and people came together to show unity and heartbreak. On Sunday, a candlelight vigil was held at the high school football field. Members of the Grace Lutheran Church, where Sydney had been baptized and confirmed, gathered to pray and hold on to the hope that she would return safely. For Sydney's family, it was too emotionally raw to be there in person, so they watched the service online. Their hearts were in their throats. They were clinging to any shred of hope they could find. No one wanted to believe the unthinkable, but with every passing hour, that dread kept growing. It felt like the world had tilted and they were just waiting for some kind of miracle. And as the days stretched into what felt like an endless heartache, Sydney's loved ones knew they needed to do something, anything to bring her home. Her father, George, stepped in front of the cameras and spoke directly to his daughter through the media. His voice was filled with love, worry, and a father's hope. School kids clipped green ribbons to their backpacks. Neighbors tied them to their fence posts. Each fluttering ribbon was a quiet prayer. We haven't forgotten you, Sydney. We're still looking. The show of unity went beyond Neely's borders, spilling into places that held special meaning for the Loofes. At Valentine High School, where Sydney's brother Levi coached basketball, the support was nothing short of heart-wrenching. The home team laced green ribbons onto their shoes, and even the visiting team, O'Neill High School, wore green warm-up gear. Two rival teams, normally focused on competition, now were standing side by side, united in hope and heartbreak. It was a scene that reminded everyone what truly mattered: family, love, and the shared desire for Sydney's safe return. For those who loved her, every act of support was another light in the darkness. Every ribbon, every Facebook share, every warm word reminded them that Sydney was not just a missing person. She was a cherished daughter, sister, and friend. It brought a fragile but much-needed sense of comfort, the kind that we all crave if, heaven forbid, this was our loved one who just vanished without a trace. As Thanksgiving weekend rolled around, the Loofe family's home began to fill with relatives who had literally dropped everything to come help this family find Sydney. Nothing else mattered. Cousins showed up from across the country, including Paige, who actually flew in from Washington. Everyone was trying to do what they could, distributing missing persons flyers, posting them in shops, gas stations, wherever someone might see them. The flyers highlighted Sydney's key features: her height of 5'7", her blonde hair and blue eyes, and that she weighed 135 pounds. And of course, the distinctive tattoos that might help identify her. They also noted what she was wearing last: a Columbia jacket and a cream-colored shirt. Details like these could mean the difference between a dead end and a crucial lead. Meanwhile, Sydney's circle of friends were rallying behind her family. Brittany Flynn was one of those friends who refused to just sit back and wait. She remembered that right before Sydney vanished, Sydney had shown her that picture of that girl, Audrey. Remember? The woman that she had been seeing from the dating site? Well, determined to help, Brittany searched through her phone until she found that exact image. It was a tangible clue. And Brittany immediately sent that photo to Sydney's sister Mackenzie, hoping that it might open a door to understanding who Audrey really was. Sydney's friend Brooklyn McChrystal also felt the urgency. With every hour that passed, hope felt more fragile. She knew they needed to act fast. So Brooklyn was thinking like a sleuth. This is something I think we would do, but she made a Tinder profile and she set it to search for only women aged 25 in the local area. And her heart was pounding as she just kept swiping through the endless faces looking for someone who looked like Audrey. And then like a lightning bolt, it hit her. She recognized that same familiar photo that Sydney had shared. It was her, the Audrey woman that Sydney had matched with. And in that moment, Brooklyn's heart was racing. She couldn't believe it, and I can't either. It's like, shouldn't the detectives already have figured this out? But no, leave it to the loved ones and friends. But this was it. An actual connection to the last person known to have seen Sydney. Brooklyn took a breath and swiped right, praying for a match. When Tinder confirmed the match, Brooklyn wasted no time at all. She messaged this Audrey person right away. Adrenaline was flooding her system. Maybe this was the break they desperately needed. Maybe this Audrey could provide answers and maybe, just maybe, bring Sydney home. Brooklyn eased into the conversation and she talked to Audrey long enough to get her phone number, and then she passed it along to Sydney's family. And they wasted no time. They immediately handed that number over to the Lincoln Police Department. Time was critical, and every new piece of information felt like it might bring them one step closer to finding Sydney. The detectives traced that number to a 23-year-old woman named Bailey Boswell. Bailey lived in Wilbur, Nebraska, and Wilbur rang alarm bells because investigators knew that Sydney's phone last pinged in Wilbur before it was either turned off or it went dead. And now there was a direct link connecting Audrey to the very place where Sydney's trail had gone cold. As the investigation deepened, the cops learned more about this girl, Bailey's living situation. She wasn't alone. She resided in a basement apartment of a house at 621 West 7th Street with her 51-year-old boyfriend, Aubrey Trail. Let me repeat that with a little more clarity. There is no Audrey, as far as investigators can tell. The picture that was used on Tinder was of Bailey, the 23-year-old woman, and she was dating a man named Aubrey with a B, not a D, and he was nearly 30 years older than she was. Together, this presented a picture that didn't quite sit right with investigators. Why this fake profile? Why the age gap? It just seemed suspicious. On November 18th, 2017, officers headed to that Wilbur address, hoping to speak with Bailey and Aubrey. They knocked, but got nothing but silence on the other side of the door. It was unnerving, given what was at stake here. Where was Sydney, and who were these people? With no response from inside, the police turned to the landlord, Alan Cole, who lived in the main portion of this home with his family. Alan told them that Bailey was quiet while Aubrey did most of the talking. Aubrey had introduced himself and Bailey as antique dealers from Falls City. He'd even gifted Alan some porcelain dolls for his grandchildren. Nothing about them ever seemed alarming. Aubrey always paid his rent on time, even covering it well into the future, which kind of struck Alan as a bit unusual, but that was hardly a red flag. But as the officers continued talking with Alan and his family, a different picture began to emerge. Alan mentioned Aubrey's habit of talking so loudly in the basement that sometimes you could hear him from upstairs. There's nothing criminal in that, but it was just a character trait worth mentioning, I guess. But when they spoke to Alan's adult daughter, Jennifer, she shared a story that put everyone on edge. It was something that didn't quite fit with the benign image of a polite antique dealer, and it was enough to make officers take notice. They might be dealing with something much darker than anyone had imagined. Jennifer Cole relayed that late on the night of November 15th, something strange caught her attention. Jennifer lived in the separate basement apartment on the same property where Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail were staying. As Jennifer and her son Dayton went about their evening, they both noticed a really sudden, sharp odor. At first, it was just a hint of something off, but before long, it became unmistakable. It was bleach, and lots of it. Now, Jennifer was allergic to this chemical, and this was no faint whiff. It made her feel sick. She couldn't figure out why anyone would need to use that much bleach, especially so late in the evening. Now, that seems like a red flag considering the circumstances and the timing. The next morning, when Jennifer and Dayton came home from being out for the day, the smell, it was overpowering. It was thick in the air. It was stinging their nose and their eyes. And this was the middle of November, and the temperatures were freezing. Definitely not the kind of weather that anyone would choose to actually open the windows and doors, but Jennifer had no choice. She flung open everything she could because she was desperate to air out their apartment. And when she descended the stairs that led down to the part of the basement where Bailey and Aubrey lived, the smell got even stronger. It was as though someone had poured bleach everywhere, soaking into the floors and the walls and who knows what else. There was just something deeply unsettling about it. This wasn't spring cleaning. This felt like someone that was trying to erase something. On November 18th, the situation escalated. With a key provided by the landlord, Alan Cole, the police were able to actually enter Bailey and Aubrey's basement apartment. The officers were on high alert. The intensity of Jennifer's story alone had raised their suspicions, and the lingering stench confirmed something wasn't right. When they stepped inside, though, everything looked surprisingly normal at first glance. Nothing obvious jumped out at them as evidence, but the smell of bleach was no small matter. If Jennifer had smelled it strongly on November 15th, and here they were 3 days later with the odor still heavy in the air, it did mean that a tremendous amount of bleach must have been used. Normal household cleaning did not leave a lasting odor like this. The officers knew they needed more than a gut feeling, though, and at this point, they didn't have much to go on except for a bleach smell, and they didn't have a search warrant, and without it, their hands were tied. They could look around, but they couldn't tear the place apart. They couldn't open the cabinets, tear up the carpet, or dig deep for any hidden evidence. So they stepped back and approached the district attorney, laying out what they had learned so far. Jennifer Cole's information about the intense bleach smell back on the 15th was key. It wasn't just an odd detail. It was potentially a huge clue that someone had tried to clean or cover something up in that apartment. The DA agreed. This was suspicious enough to grant a search warrant. With the official paperwork secured, the Lincoln Police Department brought in the experts, the Nebraska State Patrol's crime scene investigators. On November 19, 2017, these crime scene investigators arrived in Wilbur, Nebraska, determined to leave no stone unturned. Now armed with the legal right to search thoroughly, they began a careful and methodical examination of the basement apartment that Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail had called home. What they found was both curious and unsettling. Among the items discovered was a handwritten note that detailed a step-by-step guide on how to encrypt a cell phone. Now that is weird. That wasn't something that you would typically find just lying around an apartment. Why would someone need instructions for encryption unless they were trying to hide something? Investigators tucked this detail away in their mental files. This could mean the people who lived there had something to conceal or at least to make communication harder to trace. Next, the team uncovered a Dollar General receipt dated for November 15th. It was timestamped at 5 p.m. You might be wondering, what items were purchased? Well, several roasting pans and duct tape. Now, these were not inherently incriminating on their own. People buy all sorts of odd combinations of things, and Thanksgiving was coming up. But in context, it seemed odd. Sometimes criminals will buy a few things when they need the incriminating ones, because duct tape on its own may look a little odd, so they'll throw in something benign, like something ordinary. But even roasting pans seemed a little bit weird, especially alongside the mysterious and powerful bleach odor. And the timing was also suspicious. November 15th was the very night Jennifer remembered smelling that overwhelming bleach and the night that Sydney went on her date with the person named Audrey, who we know is really Bailey. So this was just another puzzle piece falling into place. As they dug deeper, they found another receipt, this time from a place called Food Mesto at 11:30 a.m. on November 16th. This receipt showed a purchase of bleach and trash bags, so a pattern was emerging, and it wasn't good. First, roasting pans and duct tape, then bleach and trash bags. These weren't random household items. They sounded like tools someone might use to hide evidence or clean up a crime scene. The bleach containers discovered on the dryer, one empty and the other half full, gave more weight to that theory. No one could say if this was just a bit of spring cleaning, not at this time yet, but it was weird that the smell was still lingering days later. And as investigators combed through Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail's apartment, they discovered something chilling. It was a book called The Human Body Atlas. Now, at first glance, it seemed like a standard reference guide on human anatomy, the type you would find maybe in a school library or a medical student's bookshelf. The cover featured a head and neck, the underlying muscles clearly visible under the skin. In other contexts, it might have been another educational book, but given the circumstances of Sydney Loofe's disappearance, no one could help but wonder why it was there and what these two people might have needed it for. My guess is probably similar to what yours is, knowing what we know about true crime cases, and it's not good. Before wrapping up their search, investigators decided to collect the gray fitted sheet from the bed. It might have DNA on it or other forensic evidence, hair, fibers, bodily fluids, anything that could point to what had transpired in this apartment. They weren't leaving empty-handed either. Every object, every receipt, every trace of unusual behavior would be analyzed. It was becoming clear to investigators they had stumbled upon something far more disturbing than just a missing persons case. Now they just had to piece it all together. The bleach-soaked odors, the suspicious receipts, the encryption instructions, and the absence of Sydney. This was all pointing towards a crime, a violent, intentional act. The investigators left the apartment with their evidence bags, and by Wednesday, November 29th, the Lincoln Police Department felt it had enough to make a public statement. They identified 51-year-old Aubrey Trail and 23-year-old Bailey Boswell as persons of interest in Sydney's disappearance, and they were wanted for questioning. The news rattled across the community. Sydney's face was everywhere, on flyers, on Facebook, on everyone's mind. And now the police were naming names and pointing fingers. After the announcement, a local antique dealer stepped forward to share that Aubrey had been a regular customer for years. Another shopkeeper mentioned that since June, Aubrey and Bailey had even rented display cabinets in their shop to sell vintage glassware and toys. And suddenly, these two weren't just two names on the news. They were people woven into the community's everyday life, calmly just selling antiques while something much deeper seemed to be going on behind the scenes. That very same day, a video surfaced online, one that would be removed from Facebook later, and then it would pop back up on YouTube. It ran about 9 minutes and looked hastily filmed. It was shot inside of a car. In it, there was a woman dressed head to toe in black, sporting dark sunglasses, and she sat beside a man who looked kind of rough around the edges and older, with these piercing blue eyes. The couple introduced themselves as Bailey and Aubrey, and this was their really bizarre public address, to a worried world. They insisted they had nothing to do with Sydney's disappearance. Bailey started speaking first, claiming that she and Sydney had gone out on a few dates in the days before Sydney had vanished. She said that on November 15th, the night that Sydney was last known to be seen, she supposedly dropped her at a friend's house after hanging out together.
Hi, good morning. I'm Bailey, Audrey on Tinder, and a few other names because I have warrants, but this really isn't about me. This is about Sydney, and I'm just kind of want to tell you what I've already told the Lincoln police more than one time. I met her on a Tuesday. We drove around Lincoln, smoked weed, had a great time. We hit it off. I dropped her off at home, picked her up the next night at her house. We drove around, smoked weed again, made our way to my house where we smoked wax and shatter, and I gave her a 1/4 ounce of some really good weed. I went to take her home, and she asked me to drop her off at a friend's house, so I did so. I gave her my number. We were planning to go to the casino that weekend. I haven't heard from her since. I really don't even know what else to say. I've been seeing all this stuff on the news presses and the magazines and the news, and I guess I just want the family to know that I'm truly sorry and I didn't have anything to do with this, and I hope that Sydney is found very soon. She is a sweet, amazing girl.
Bailey painted a picture of a normal evening. They drove around, they smoked pot, and then they just parted ways. Then Aubrey chimed in, backing up Bailey's story and adding they'd taken Sydney back to her apartment in Wilbur before heading off to this mysterious friend's place. According to them, that was the last time they saw her. They acted as though they were genuinely puzzled by all the suspicion. Like, why were the police wanting to talk to them, they wondered.
But we've spent the last few days watching ourselves being slammed and crucified in the newspapers and the news and everything else, so we thought it was time we had our say. The Lincoln Police Department apparently wants everyone to believe that we're hiding, that we haven't talked to them, that we're avoiding them. Actually, we've spoken to the Lincoln Police Department a couple of times. We both wrote long statements and sent to the Lincoln Police Department telling them everything we know. They're telling you that they have all these leads, that Sydney was last seen in Wilbur and such. What they're not telling you is that we are the two people who gave them all these leads.
They even said they already gave a statement to the police, but they hadn't heard anything back, and they weren't going to be turning themselves in because Aubrey admitted that he had an outstanding warrant, but he claimed it was an unrelated crime.
You've heard all of this stuff about my criminal history. All true. Been convicted of bad checks and forgery and all that good stuff, but never been convicted of anything like, I guess I'm a person of interest on now. And oh yeah, the Lincoln Police Department failed to tell you that me and Bailey do about $100,000 a year business in antiques on eBay, the antique malls in Lincoln, Omaha, all this stuff. They will have you believe that I'm still just a criminal running around, and I assume that I have a warrant out of state somewhere now, so that kind of cancels that out. So this has pretty much cost me my life, and I appreciate that from the Lincoln Police Department and the FBI and all those other agencies.
In reality, those warrants were for serious charges: a felon in possession of a firearm and habitual criminal counts, plus a history of felony convictions in Nebraska for forgery and bad checks when he lived in South Dakota. Aubrey ended the video on an unsettling note, saying that he was praying for Sydney and hoping for her safe return. He mentioned how terrible it was that she wasn't home with her family at Thanksgiving.
I pray for Sydney. I hope she's found soon. I wish the family the best. I'm sorry that she wasn't with you on Thanksgiving. And that's pretty much all I can say for now.
He said these things as though he was some distant acquaintance who was worried about this tragedy, this missing person. The whole performance just felt off. It was like it was rehearsed and just way too casual. And it was pretty alarming how defiant they were being. This seemed to be turning into something more sinister. And the people at the center of it were putting on a show for the cameras, leaving everyone to wonder what they were really hiding behind all of their carefully chosen words. That very night, firefighters descended upon a pond in Wilbur, a body of water located between Aubrey Trail's apartment and Sydney's apartment, determined to find something, anything that might lead them to Sydney. And it was grueling, backbreaking work. They trudged in the cold, dark water, shovels in hand, tearing at the muddy bottom, using skid loaders, and they scooped piles of dirt and sediment along the banks. But despite their best efforts, by the time dawn approached, they came up empty-handed. No trace of Sydney was found in that murky water. As word of Sydney's disappearance spread, her story gripped not just Lincoln or Nebraska, but the entire nation. Suddenly, the name Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail weren't just local suspects. They were names recognized across the country, whispered in coffee shops and living rooms as people tried to make sense of what was unfolding. The Lincoln Police Department was flooded with tips. Some were plausible leads. Others were so bizarre, they sounded like they were urban legends. The department was overwhelmed, so much so they had to actually hire an intern just to sort through all of this information. And meanwhile, the FBI also dedicated a hotline solely for Sydney's case. Their agents were listening to every single caller, hoping that somewhere in all the noise, a critical piece of evidence would surface. Among the sea of tips, one caught investigators' attention. It came from a Days Inn in Spencer, Nebraska, almost a 4-hour drive away, where the general manager, Hunter Birdsall, recognized the faces of Bailey and Aubrey from that Facebook post. She recalled that back on November 23rd, the day before Thanksgiving, Bailey and Aubrey had checked into her hotel. They paid in cash, and during their stay, Aubrey had made a really offhanded joke about his wife Bailey never cooking for him as they ate simple bowls of soup prepared by the hotel manager. And then on November 26th, they just checked out of the hotel and there was nothing too out of the ordinary at the time. But by the time Hunter called in the tip line on November 28th, Bailey and Aubrey were long gone. This pattern where the couple arrives, the couple leaves, always seemingly on the move, was becoming more and more clear. Because that same day, November 28th, Jenny Bloom, a front desk clerk at Grand Stay Hotel in Iowa, also saw their faces on a news report after finishing her shift. And it sent a chill through her because she recognized them immediately. They had been staying at her hotel as well. Earlier that very morning, the couple had even requested to extend their stay. Jenny promptly contacted the tip line, knowing that she could be holding a vital piece of this puzzle. By the time the local police arrived at Grand Stay, Bailey and Aubrey had vanished yet again. They left in such a hurry, they left behind Aubrey's walking cane and a couple of bags. Those bags contained maps of Iowa and even Mexico. This was a find that raised the tension to a new level. According to FBI agent Jackie Han, it looked like someone had literally woken up and disappeared without a trace. No goodbyes, no checkout, just gone, leaving suspicion and fear in their wake. I mean, clearly when they have maps of Mexico and they keep moving from one state to the other, it really looked like they were going to leave the country. And as the FBI dug deeper, their agents followed the digital trail left behind by Bailey and Aubrey. According to phone records, on the night of November 15th, Sydney was about to meet up with Audrey again. or I should say Bailey, so I'll just say Bailey, right before their date, Sydney sent Bailey a careful, almost nervous text. She wanted to be absolutely sure it would just be the two of them hanging out together. No hidden partners, no unexpected third parties trying to rope her into something that she wasn't interested in. Bailey said it would just be the two of them, no tricks. Then at 6:54 p.m., Bailey let Sydney know she was there. She just texted her here, meaning that she had arrived at Sydney's apartment to pick her up. The FBI then turned to the couple's odd Facebook video denying involvement in Sydney's disappearance. Behind the scenes, FBI agents pored over thousands of IP addresses and phone numbers linked to the device that uploaded that video. It was meticulous, painstaking work, cyber sleuthing at its most intense. And eventually, they zeroed in on a track phone, a burner device with no subscriber information available. Aside from posting that now infamous video, the mystery phone had made a single call at 11:27 a.m., the same day the video was posted on November 28th. The call went out to Windmill Inn in Branson, Missouri, 6 hours and a whole state away. Now, this lead was significant because they found out that Aubrey and Bailey had previously stayed at the Windmill Inn over the summer before Sydney had disappeared. An FBI special agent reached out to the local authorities in Branson asking for their help. They needed eyes on the ground. And when the Branson sheriff checked the Windmill Inn in the parking lot, he immediately spotted the silver Chrysler Sebring registered to Aubrey and Bailey. And just like that, the chase took a new turn. In less than a day, authorities had pulled eyewitness testimonies from across state lines. They found leads from hotel clerks and managers and connected the dots between a suspicious phone call and a parked car in a distant lot. Every new piece of information tightened the net around Bailey and Aubrey, and each clue carried with it even more dread. Sydney was still missing. The clock was ticking, and her family held on to hope, praying that these frantic moves by law enforcement would lead to answers. It was a nationwide manhunt, and the stakes, loved ones longing for closure, the public craving justice, could not have been higher. By the early morning hours of November 30th, the tide seemed to be turning in the search for Sydney Loofe. U.S. Marshals acting on unrelated warrants tracked down and arrested Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell. It wasn't directly for Sydney's disappearance, but their sudden capture sparked a fresh wave of media coverage and fueled a glimmer of hope among those who loved her. Everyone knew who these two people were by now, and they were holding their breath to see what this development would mean. Sydney's father, George, stepped forward again, pleading for anyone with information to please come forward. In his eyes, there was no doubt that somebody out there knew something. If they had any knowledge of where Sydney was, now was the time to speak up.
On behalf of our family, I would like to thank all of you, all of the people that have made the pins, made the flyers, gotten the word out on social media, all the support that our family has received. Continue that, and thank you for all of your prayers. And in my opinion, someone knows something. Please do the right thing. Thank you.
Aubrey and Bailey, now in custody, were taken to the Taney County Jail in Forsyth, Mississippi, just a short drive from Branson. Their arrest sparked a huge surge of cautious optimism. Lincoln Police Department Chief Jeff Bleemeister addressed reporters, openly holding on to hope that Sydney might still be alive. When asked if there was a reason to believe that she could be found safe, he didn't hesitate. He said, yes, absolutely. Behind the scenes, investigators were working around the clock. Officer Bob Hurley of the Lincoln Police Department meticulously analyzed cell phone records, plotting points on a map to see where Aubrey and Bailey's phones had traveled. He was looking for patterns, places they might have dumped evidence, or worse, a body. The bleach smell at the couple's apartment and the silence stretching on without any word from Sydney made it hard to stay optimistic. Officer Hurley dug deeper into the cell records, discovering that on November 16th, one day after Sydney vanished, Aubrey and Bailey left their Wilbur apartment and returned around 5:45 p.m. after a strange 151-mile trip to a rural area near Clay County. Why go there? of all places. What was so important? They had to make this journey into the middle of nowhere. Focusing on these phone signals, Hurley noticed that at certain points along this isolated gravel road, the couple's phones had slowed down and even stopped for a significant stretch of time. This was no random detour. Something must have happened at these coordinates. Armed with this unsettling clue, on December 4th, around 50 law enforcement officers fanned out into Clay County. This was the countryside, and they searched, systematically trekking through fields, ditches, anywhere else a criminal might hide evidence. The area narrowed to a spot north of County Road 308 and Road S near Edgar, Nebraska, based on this phone data. Aubrey and Bailey's devices had lingered in this exact location, and one of the officers involved in the search, Nebraska State Patrol Officer Corey Townsend, carefully pushed through the cattails and all the brush. The day was cold. The atmosphere was tense. They knew what they might find. No one wanted it to be true. Then came the call that made everyone's stomachs drop. The Clay County Sheriff signaled that something had been discovered, and lying there were multiple garbage bags. This is unreal. It didn't take long for a forensic expert to sense they had stumbled upon something absolutely horrific. Inside those bags, officers found human remains. Parts of them, anyway. No one needed to say anything out loud because everyone knew what it meant. For Sydney's family and friends who had prayed and pleaded for a different ending, this was confirmation of their worst nightmare. Her life, so full of promise and warmth, had come to a tragic end because it had to be her. The officers who stood there in that bleak rural landscape were trained professionals, but they're also human beings. Their hearts were heavy with the knowledge that this was someone's daughter, someone's sister. A friend had been so callously harmed, and in that moment, all the hope and desperate optimism were replaced with a solemn vow to get justice for Sydney Loofe. If love and community support couldn't bring her back, then at least truth and accountability would ensure her life was never forgotten, and that those responsible would face the full measure of the law. Soon, crime scene investigators were called in, and they began to carefully sift through the contents of those black trash bags. The tone of this entire operation shifted when they found a right arm marked with a familiar tattoo. The quote, "Everything will be wonderful someday." It was the same powerful message that Sydney had carried so proudly on her body, a symbol of hope that she had for her future. But now that hopeful phrase was an agonizing confirmation of this woman's identity. And by that night, the tragic news was shared online by her heartbroken family. Sydney's body had been recovered. The world that loved her was shattered when they learned she was never coming home. Within those bags, investigators discovered more clues. There was a fragment of a map, a sheet, and a shower curtain smeared with blood. It was a collection of evidence that hinted at a horrifying final chapter. As darkness settled in and the wind whipped across the scene, it became almost impossible for them to work effectively. So the investigators had to protect this crime scene at all costs. So they made the painful decision to halt their work until the next morning. They secured this whole area, aware that the truth was hidden in there somewhere in this lonely stretch of Nebraska farmland. And on Tuesday, December 5th, the team returned. And this time, they brought in even more resources. A Nebraska State Patrol helicopter hovered above them as officers systematically searched every inch of ground for additional evidence. Their efforts were not in vain. Hundreds of pieces of evidence emerged as they painstakingly combed through the fields. Among the newly discovered items were a discarded sauna suit, latex gloves, kitchen gloves, an adult toy, and duct tape. Equally chilling was the white fleece Columbia brand jacket, just like the one that Sydney had been wearing in her Snapchat story that she posted on November 15th, the night that she disappeared. 3 days after Sydney's remains were initially found, crime scene investigators uncovered more evidence scattered along Nebraska's Highway 41. It was as though someone had just thrown these things from a moving car's passenger window. They found pieces of what once was Sydney's driver's license. It was cut into fragments. As they pieced it back together, the investigators were greeted by her smiling face in the photograph. Alongside that were pieces of broken parts of her cell phone and more shards of her life that was cruelly discarded. In that same area, investigators came across a pair of men's underwear, a green 4XL tall shirt spattered with strange white stains, a single size 7 left bare paw boot, a green dish glove, and 2 men's socks. All of these items appeared to have been tossed aside in haste. And you could guess what the white stains were on the clothing. They definitely raised immediate suspicion. They were not chemically tested, but the detectives strongly suggested it was probably bleach, recalling the overpowering odor that neighbor Jennifer Cole had reported back in Wilbur. With each and every one of these findings, investigators were forced to confront the reality of what may have happened to Sydney Loofe. Disturbingly, one portion of her upper left arm, specifically the section above the elbow and below the shoulder, was never found. To determine how Sydney died, forensic experts got involved. Dr. Michelle Elliff, a seasoned medical examiner, performed Sydney's autopsy, and during this investigation, the doctor noted several key details. There was a small bump on the top of Sydney's head and marks on the top of her wrist. This suggested that she may have been bound or restrained. There were scrapes on her back and elbows, and that hinted that Sydney may have struggled or fought back. One of the most alarming discoveries, though, was a torn earlobe, an injury inflicted shortly before she died. Even with the fact that some of Sydney's neck area, including the crucial hyoid bone, was still missing, the doctor concluded that strangulation played a role in her death. With that, she ruled Sydney's death a homicide. And I am not trying to be sarcastic or funny. It isn't funny. But I was just thinking, wouldn't it be obvious when someone's been so viciously maimed and discarded like this? And you might be wondering the same thing, but people can die of something natural and then be dismembered or harmed in this way. So they have to be specific, because you know how defense attorneys can be. They'd be like, no, she died from natural causes. And then, these people got scared, so they just got rid of her body. The doctor's findings were just one piece of this puzzle. Forensic anthropologist Steve Sims had come in. He was an expert in knife and saw marks. He was brought in to examine Sydney's skeletal remains. His specialty was analyzing cuts left on bones in dismemberment cases. I swear there's an expert for everything. Through his careful analysis, he determined that a hacksaw with roughly 25 teeth had been used in this horrific act. However, he couldn't say how much force it would have taken or whether a man or a woman carried out the dismemberment. These were such brutal details, but they were necessary to solve this case. Investigators circled back to the apartment in Wilbur, where Aubrey Trail and Billy Boswell had lived. They needed to confirm whether Sydney had been killed there and identify which tools might have been used. Everything collected from the apartment to the roadsides was sent to the FBI lab in Quantico for painstaking analysis. The lab work was extensive, but it revealed no definitive fingerprints. It was as though these killers had gone to great lengths to erase their tracks. Yet even though the direct forensic evidence was minor, FBI forensic tech Marcy Plaza still managed to make a critical discovery. She found Sydney's blood on a rubber glove and a star-patterned pair of pants recovered along the roadside. The presence of blood confirmed the items were connected to the crime, but unfortunately, they couldn't determine who had been wearing them when the murder took place. They also discovered something else, some trace DNA linking Aubrey Trail's DNA to an extension cord found discarded west of Wilbur. Investigators theorized that this cord could have been used in the act of strangulation. The DNA evidence wasn't definitive, but it definitely provided a faint link in this case. Another connection emerged when the sheet found with Sydney's remains was matched to the sheet that was earlier taken from Aubrey and Bailey's apartment. Now they know that the sheet had originally come from their home, tying the disposal of Sydney's remains directly back to them. Even without clear fingerprints, the puzzle pieces were aligning. Clothing and personal effects along the roadside, blood traces, suspicious cleaning efforts, and discarded belongings all pointed towards Aubrey and Bailey. In the end, what was pieced together told the story of an unimaginably horrific murder of Sydney Loofe. She had been lured, killed, dismembered, and scattered across rural Nebraska. Every bit of evidence, from the torn bra they found to the missing piece of her arm, to the brazenly discarded driver's license on the road and the bloodstained clothing, brought the investigators closer to understanding her final moments. On December 9th, 2017, about 100 people gathered in the Sunken Garden gazebo in Lincoln, Nebraska for a candlelight vigil honoring Sydney's life. The crowd was made up of her friends, family, acquaintances, and also people who had never met her but felt compelled to show their support. The mix of unfamiliar and familiar faces was just a testament of how her story had reached far and wide. No one could remain indifferent to the cruelty that was inflicted on this innocent girl. Within the gathering, one particular woman stood out. She didn't know Sydney personally, but she'd been following every news update, every social media post about the disappearance. She held a candle in the cool evening air and cried softly, admitting how terrified she felt since learning of Sydney's case. It could have been anyone, she said. It could have been her own child. And that fear was felt across the community. Sydney's tragedy forced everyone to confront a horrifying truth, that no community is immune to violence. Sydney's friends tried to find ways to celebrate her life amid their tears. They played her favorite songs, and of course one of those songs was the song Wonderful by Everclear. Before her murder, those lyrics, everything will be wonderful someday, had been very symbolic, and now even more so, but they felt twisted and cruelly ironic. It was a reminder for Sydney that the hopeful future would never come and that everything wouldn't be wonderful. By December 11th, the day of Sydney's funeral, it was clear just how deeply she had touched the community. The parking lot of Grace Lutheran Church, where she had grown up, was crammed with cars an hour before the service even began. Vehicles lined the nearby streets, stretching all the way past the high school. Mourners packed into every available space, even spilling outside and around the block. Sydney's co-workers from Menards were there too. They were given the day off so that they could say goodbye. The weather matched the mood, cold, gray, and overcast. 3 days later, on December 14th, Aubrey Trail and Billy Boswell appeared in court. The hearings were brief, less than 5 minutes each, and they both pleaded not guilty. There was no comfort, no closure. In fact, everyone was left feeling like the answers were still out of reach. On December 18th, the Lincoln Journal-Star published an exclusive interview with none other than Aubrey Trail. It was conducted at the Saline County Jail. In this interview, he acknowledged that he was considered a suspect in Sydney's murder, but he refused to answer questions that might incriminate him. He mentioned a recorded jail phone call, hinting that he was mindful of what he said and who he said it to. In that guarded conversation, Trail revealed a few details about his relationship with Bailey. He said that they met in the fall of 2016 at a social event in St. Joseph, Missouri, where he had been teaching her the tricks of the antique trade. He also said they moved to Wilbur in mid-2017, but the bigger picture remained frustratingly very elusive. Why had Sydney been targeted? What exactly happened that horrific night? With the official news channels releasing very limited information, of course, rumors and theories were spreading. Some people speculated that Sydney's murder was connected to a string of other dismemberment cases across the country. The coincidence of such a brutal crime made people wonder if something more sinister was at play. But the FBI stepped in and publicly stated that they believe that Sydney's murder was an isolated incident, not part of a larger pattern. This confirmation was a little bit reassuring to the community, but it didn't bring Sydney back. In mid-January of 2018, a grand jury handed down over a dozen charges against Bailey and Aubrey, all of which had nothing to do with Sydney Loofe's murder. Instead, all of these charges were tied to a complicated fraud scheme. And here's what U.S. Attorney Stephen Russell said happened. He said back in November of 2015, Aubrey, using the fake name Alan, approached a couple from Kansas. He pitched them a deal. They would all invest in a valuable gold coin, sell it, and then split the profit. But the truth is, according to Russell, the coin that Aubrey showed them wasn't nearly as valuable as he pretended it was. To make it look real, though, Aubrey and Bailey allegedly created fake documents and websites to trick this poor couple. Bailey posed as a sort of broker, giving the scam the appearance of a legitimate investment opportunity. And these victims were pressured to give up their money for supposed travel-related expenses needed to sell this coin. Between early October and November 5th, the victims handed over $24,000, and their total losses when all the false deal and promises added up, it went, wait for it, above $400,000. Not only that, Aubrey and Bailey were accused of making these victims drive them from Kansas to Nebraska under false pretenses, dragging them deeper into the scheme. At the time the grand jury considered these charges, Aubrey was locked up in the detention center in a maximum security prison in Kansas. He'd been moved there after refusing to eat anything in Nebraska jail, though he insisted he wasn't on a hunger strike. Meanwhile, his accomplice, Bailey, was held in the Saline County Jail in Wilbur, Nebraska. On January 22, 2018, Bailey pleaded not guilty to the federal fraud charges. And here's when things get a little bit crazy. Just a couple days later, on January 24th, Aubrey admitted in a phone call with the Lincoln Journal-Star that he was accountable for Sydney's death. However, he didn't go into detail about exactly what happened. He only hinted that eventually Bailey would be charged with Sydney's murder too. When discussing the unrelated federal charges, Aubrey tried to downplay them, calling it things like a business deal gone wrong. And on February 5th, 2018, Aubrey gave even more information about Sydney's death. It was a really disgusting turn of events because this man just came out and admitted that he killed Sydney just like that. And he added that it was an accidental death during a sex act gone wrong involving asphyxiation. He claimed that there were 2 other women present who were not Bailey, and he insisted he never called 911 because he feared that no one would believe him. Well, I wonder why. To Sydney's loved ones, his words were just cruel. According to his story, on November 15th of 2017, Bailey brought Sydney back to their apartment. Then all 3 of them left the apartment and went to another friend's house, somewhere in Saline County. Aubrey did not give an exact location. He said that while he was holding an object that restricted Sydney's breathing, something went terribly wrong, and she died. But he insisted that he never meant to kill her. Aubrey claimed that Bailey wasn't even in the room at that moment. When asked why he never called authorities to try to save Sydney or even explain what happened, Aubrey said he didn't think that they would treat him fairly because of his lifestyle. Basically, he believed the authorities would judge them and not give them a fair chance to explain what happened and that it wasn't on purpose. Still, Aubrey said he wasn't trying to make any excuses. He called Sydney's death a tragic accident that never should have happened, and even stated he deserved life in prison or the death penalty for what he had done. On Wednesday, March 7th, in 2018, in a Nebraska courtroom, Aubrey Trail appeared before U.S. Magistrate Judge Cheryl Wart. Aubrey was facing 14 federal charges unrelated to Sydney Loofe's murder. Rather than rely on an attorney, though, Aubrey announced his intention to represent himself. Of course he did. In a letter that he had sent to the judge, he complained about being housed in a Kansas prison, which he said made it difficult to communicate with his lawyer, who was based back in Lincoln, Nebraska. The judge strongly advised Aubrey against trying to handle his own defense. She made it clear that the charges were serious and warned him if he was found guilty of even half of them, he would likely never leave prison. She explained that an experienced attorney's help was crucial, especially considering Aubrey's lack of legal training. But still, Aubrey insisted he could do a better job than a defense attorney if he were moved closer to the case materials in Wilbur, Nebraska. He argued that if he was given the right resources, he could effectively represent himself. No final ruling was made that day and the matter was postponed. And then on March 22nd, several months after Sydney's disappearance and tragic murder, the search for clues still hadn't ended. Law enforcement officers continued to scour the roadside near where her body had been found. Along Nebraska Highway 15, an officer stumbled upon a white, off-the-shoulder top that perfectly matched the one Sydney had worn in her last Snapchat image. Just 3 miles further down the same road, the officer found another heartbreaking piece of evidence, a multicolored bra with a slit in one of the cups. Later, it would be determined that this bra belonged to Sydney, and over time, a total of 13 pieces of Sydney's body were discovered by investigators. On Monday, June 11th, the Nebraska Attorney General's office finally filed first-degree murder charges and improper disposal of human remain charges against Aubrey and Bailey in connection with Sydney Loofe's death. According to the affidavit, Bailey, posing as Audrey on Tinder, had lured Sydney into a deadly trap. The court documents painted a chilling picture of November 15th, the day that Sydney's life ended. Sydney started her shift at Menards in Lincoln, not knowing that Aubrey and Bailey were at Home Depot, caught on security cameras purchasing tools that would be later used in her murder. These included a hacksaw, tin snips, drop cloths, utility knives. I mean, what else would they be buying these items for? Then came another unsettling piece of evidence. After leaving Home Depot, Aubrey allegedly went to Menards, where Sydney worked, and he passed her as though he was a regular customer. We have footage of this. It captured a brief moment where Aubrey seemed to even look back at Sydney, but Sydney showed no signs of knowing who he was or that she was in any danger. That same day, Bailey made a run to a Dollar General store in Wilbur, Nebraska, where she bought trash bags, laundry detergent, bleach, roasting pans, and duct tape. Ordinary items on their own, but damning evidence when placed in the context of what happened to Sydney. Phone records revealed a timeline. After Bailey picked Sydney up from her workplace and headed back towards Wilbur, calls between Aubrey and Bailey lit up their phone records. Once all three, Sydney, Aubrey, and Bailey, were in Wilbur, Sydney's phone suddenly went dark. Aubrey's and Bailey's phone later powered back on, but Sydney's never did. This suggested that something terrible happened shortly after she arrived in that small town. And later that same day, in June of 2018, right after Aubrey Trail was officially charged with Sydney's murder, FBI agents Ellie McBride and Mike Masseth visited him in Saline County Jail. Although Aubrey was hesitant at first, he did agree to talk to them. The result was a tense 3-hour interrogation, during which investigators hoped to finally piece together the truth behind Sydney Loofe's tragic murder. In this interrogation room, seated across from the FBI agents, Aubrey Trail revealed the horrific details that would actually haunt anyone who heard them, even if they were seasoned detectives. He spoke in a disturbingly calm and very detached manner, even just sipping on his coffee, as he described how he drained Sydney's blood, dismembered her body, and discarded her remains. He seemed unshaken by the gravity of what he was saying. The words that were coming out of his mouth didn't even seem to matter to him. Agent McBride pressed Aubrey for even more details, and at one point, he asked about Sydney's heart. Aubrey answered in a matter-of-fact tone. He said, "To the best of my knowledge, nobody cut her heart out." And then he went on to say that he'd chosen a spot near a cemetery to leave her remains because it was, in his mind, a sacred place. He believed that leaving her there would somehow allow her spirit to move on quickly. This was a twisted explanation that did not offer any comfort, and it made no sense to investigators. You're doing this terrible thing and you think putting her in a cemetery is going to make a difference? Aubrey claimed the entire situation stemmed from this sex fantasy that had gone wrong. According to him, he offered Sydney $5,000 to participate on the night of November 15th. He insisted that he never intended to kill her, saying her death was just a terrible accident. When the agent pushed him, asking how Sydney ended up dead at his hands and why his hands had been around her neck, Aubrey clammed up. He did not provide an explanation. The agents then confronted Aubrey with what they knew. Before Sydney disappeared, Aubrey and Bailey had gone shopping at various stores. Security footage and even receipts showed them buying tools that the investigators believed were intended for killing and dismembering Sydney, and this was before they picked her up. Aubrey just brushed this off. He claimed that those items were nothing more than household supplies. He even mentioned that 2 other women, and neither one were Bailey, had been in the bedroom at the time that Sydney died. Aubrey even hinted that he had videotaped the entire incident, but he refused to share any of the recordings with the agents. On June 15th, still behind bars, Aubrey called the Lincoln Journal-Star to express frustration over his charges. He firmly denied pre-planning Sydney's murder, maintaining his stance that her death was not intentional. And by July of that same year, the legal maneuvering continued. His attorney, Corey Ryman, and yes, he had an attorney now, filed a motion requesting the court's permission to take a step back. And then on July 12th, Assistant Nebraska Attorney General Sandra Allen weighed in during a court appearance. She painted a haunting portrait of Aubrey's background, describing a long history of violent and terrorizing behavior. To her, the nature of Sydney's death showed exceptional, depraved mind, something so far beyond common morality or intelligence that the state believed the ultimate punishment was warranted. And that's when they announced they would be seeking the death penalty for Aubrey Trail. In Nebraska, the death penalty requires certain aggravating circumstances, including a defendant's history of violence. And Aubrey Trail's criminal background gave the prosecution a very strong basis to seek capital punishment. On August 3rd, Aubrey and Bailey were sentenced on their unrelated federal charges. Aubrey to 10 years in prison and Bailey to 5. When Aubrey was told his sentence, his demeanor quickly switched to just very evil. He laughed uncontrollably, and then he said, "I'm facing the death penalty. I don't care what you give me." And he tried to actually blame his victims for what happened, even Sydney for what he did to her. Now, when it was Bailey's turn to be sentenced, her public defender, Jessica Milburn, tried to describe her as full of energy. She was this bright person who became lost after certain college events, and then she fell under Aubrey's influence. Bailey declined to speak at her own sentencing, only whispering, "I love you," to her grandmother before leaving. Yes, they're trying to say, that Bailey was kind of just influenced by this older man, got involved with this wrong person, and everything kind of went downhill. But remember, this is not Sydney's murder trial. This is just what they did with the pottery and the coin and the antiques and pretending and gaining money from victims that they tried to trick into this antique dealing. And then in March of 2019, so we're talking about a year later, additional charges alleged that Aubrey and Bailey planned to kill someone as early as July 2017, and they targeted Sydney through Tinder. On June 17th of 2019, Aubrey pleaded guilty to disposing of Sydney's remains. He did express remorse, but he once again claimed he never intended her death. And then 2 days later, his murder trial began. Prosecutor Sandra Allen argued that Sydney's death was a planned, sexually motivated murder, orchestrated by Aubrey and Bailey because they wanted to feel what it was like to kill someone. Sydney's family had to leave the courtroom when the details of her dismemberment were described. Aubrey's defense attorney, Joel Murray, countered that argument that this was a sex fantasy gone wrong, not a deliberate murder, though he admitted Aubrey had dismembered Sydney's body out of panic. I told you what they were going to say. I told you they were going to make it sound like it wasn't a murder like it was. As the trial continued, FBI agents testified about evidence from the couple's Wilbur apartment. Witnesses like Hunter Birdsall, the Days Inn manager, Jenny Bloom, the hotel clerk in Iowa, and CSI Bob Hurley with the cell phone ping analysis. They all took the stand. A shocking interruption came, though, when Aubrey suddenly, out of nowhere, shouted, "Bailey's innocent and I curse you all!" And then he slashed his own neck 3 times in front of the jury. Yep, this case is so twisted.
Please be seated.
Bailey is innocent and I curse you all.
Stop recording.
After this chaotic scene, the jury was then instructed to please disregard that outburst. And I'm sitting there thinking, excuse me, how? How do you disregard something like that? But then 2 days later, the trial proceeded without Aubrey present. And then jurors saw the graphic photos of Sydney's remains. Although the defense objected, the judge allowed these images. Sydney's father looked away as the jury viewed these disturbing photographs. And there was further testimony that revealed how Aubrey and Bailey bought the tools prior to meeting Sydney, suggesting that this murder was premeditated. FBI agent Mike Masseth introduced evidence of a strange list found in Bailey's purse, referencing women with magical powers. And a witness, Ashley Hills, who had also been approached by this murderous couple, testified about the lifestyle that Aubrey would offer to women. Stolen antiques, claimed he was a vampire, and proposals for murder for hire in exchange for joining his group of, wait for it, witches. I'm not kidding. She described orgies involving choking, alleged prior killings that Aubrey would boast about, and a direct threat on her life if she ever revealed their plans.
Within a few weeks of meeting Aubrey Trail and Boswell, Ashley Hills testified that they started talking about witchcraft. Trail said he was a vampire who could fly, and Boswell was a witch, and she could become one too.
To get your power, you would have to breathe in someone else's last breath.
She says Boswell and Trail talked about torturing people. Hill says Boswell was joyful when discussing this.
She would smile and giggle, and her eyes would light up almost.
They even made plans for Hills to kill someone, meeting a potential victim at a Walmart. Trail told her they would drive out into the woods and she and Boswell would kill the victim.
It was my understanding that when we got out there, everything would be set up, such as a tarp.
Hill says at the time she believed everything Trail told her, but now she doesn't.
I think he's a psychopath.
Somebody who uses people?
Yes.
He used you?
Yes.
Used Bailey Boswell?
Yes. I think he's a con artist.
Hills left the relationship in September 2017 because she didn't want to kill anyone.
Why didn't you contact law enforcement after you left the group?
I was scared.
Why were you scared?
Because I was told that if I ever told anyone that I'd be killed and my family would be killed.
On July 8th, the medical examiner testified, and she described the injuries on Sydney's body, including the scrapes, a torn earlobe, and the ligature marks. Of course, the defense suggested that these were from rough consensual intercourse, but the prosecution maintained that they were clear evidence of violence. A forensic expert came forward and talked about the marks on the bones, consistent with a hacksaw teeth, and the prosecution linked these marks to the Stanley hacksaw that Aubrey and Bailey had purchased before Sydney's murder, further reinforcing premeditation. The jury was left to weigh these very different narratives in the face of overwhelming and often horrific evidence that was presented to them. And on Tuesday, July 9th, Aubrey Trail took the stand to testify in his own defense. He claimed he first met Sydney Loofe at Menards while she worked as a cashier, and he noticed her crying. Aubrey said he saw this as an opportunity to recruit her into his twisted circle, a group of young women who referred to him as Daddy and engaged in dark fantasies about murder and torture. Sickening. But he insisted that none of these things ever happened. They were all hypothetical fantasies. Aubrey testified that he paid Sydney an allowance and gave her gifts as long as she followed his strict rules. No clothes, no questions, and complete obedience. So what they were alleging was that they were already friends and connected before, and she was like up in this scheme with them. And then he said that under the Tinder alias Audrey, Bailey reconnected with Sydney in November of 2017. But at that point, Bailey looked completely different, so Sydney didn't recognize her. But to counter this argument, the prosecutor asked why Sydney didn't react to Aubrey when he passed her in Menards on November 15th. And he just said, oh, maybe she didn't notice me. I don't know. This doesn't seem to really add up to me. And he changed his story once again. He said, no, I lied to police. Sydney didn't die during a paid act of intercourse with two other women. He was now saying that she had a seizure in his apartment. What did I tell you? They always come up with these stories. Oh, she died from natural causes. They weren't buying it. He said he tried. He tried but failed to do mouth to mouth, and then she died. He confessed that he should have called 911, but he feared getting caught for his outstanding warrants. It was all about him. Even if that was the truth, it was all about him.
It was only me, Bailey, and Sydney there the night Sydney died. And I'll get into how it happened, I guess. But no, there was no two other girls there. There was no sexual fantasy. I don't really care what you believe. I mean, this is what happened. Can't nothing change that. I can't bring Sydney Loofe back.
And then he said that after he was arrested, he just kept lying in all of his interrogations to confuse investigators. I swear this man was all over the place, and he's still lying. On Wednesday, July 20th, the jury found Aubrey Trail guilty of first-degree murder and being an accomplice to murder. He showed no emotion at the verdict. Sydney's mother, Susie, and sister, Mackenzie, wept quietly in the courtroom. But it's not over. He still had to be sentenced, and in the meanwhile, in September of 2019, Bailey Boswell's attorney, Todd Lancaster, requested a change of venue because there was so much media coverage after Aubrey's trial, and the judge agreed, and they moved Bailey's trial from Saline County to Lexington, Nebraska. On September 25th, Bailey's trial began. Prosecutors were seeking the death penalty, while Bailey's defense depicted her as a victim manipulated by Aubrey. After 3 hours, the jury finally found Bailey guilty. They pretty much heard all the same evidence that was in the first trial, but it was geared towards pointing to her as being involved. And in March of 2021, Aubrey appeared before a 3-judge panel, judges Vicki Johnson, Michael A. Smith, and Susan Strong, to determine this man's sentence. His defense highlighted a troubled childhood and a time in foster care, hoping to avoid the death penalty. But then Aubrey addressed the court. And this was wild. But finally, I feel like he was telling some truths. I'm not sure, but I'm going to play it for you and you can be the judge.
I don't want to do this like a coward. Is there any way that I can come to that side of the table and face the Loofe family when I read this statement to them?
No, sir, you need to stay where you are.
Yes, ma'am. I realize that nothing I can say here today will change in the least what I did to Sydney 3.5 years ago. During my interviews with law enforcement and here in this courtroom, a lot of lies were told about Sydney Loofe. I was fighting a death penalty case, so telling the truth was the farthest thing from my mind, and I would now like to clear those up. Sydney Loofe did not die as a result of erotic asphyxiation. I murdered her. Sydney was never a part of our group. She was never paid to participate in any sexual or criminal activities, nor did she ever make phone calls for me in any of my scams. Sydney was never at the Grand Weaver Motel with me. Sydney was never at the apartment prior to the one time in November of 2017. Until now, I have never told the truth about how and why Sydney died. Almost everything I said was a lie unless it benefited me. The state got a lot of it right, but not some of the biggest things. I did use Bailey to lure Sydney to the apartment as I had done with all the girls. You heard 3 of them testify at my trial. The plan, however, was not to get her there to kill her, but to pull her into our little group. I used women for sex and in my criminal activities. Killing her intentionally would have been very counterproductive. I do not deny, however, that I premeditated Sydney's murder. The only difference is it was 2 or 3 hours after she got to the apartment that I decided to kill her, and not days in advance. But premeditation, as I understand, is premeditation, and that makes very little difference. I seriously misjudged Sydney from her and Bailey's messages and what happened on their first date. Once I sat Sydney down and started explaining how we made money, some of our criminal activities, and about the group sex and other things, I knew I had made a bad mistake as Sydney somewhat freaked out. I tried for about 30 minutes to calm her down and had Bailey talk to her, but it did no good. I finally restrained her by tying her hands in front of her. I took her in the bedroom and told her to lay down and relax and warned her what would happen if she didn't. The truth is, I killed Sydney because of her reaction to what I had told her and shown her. I had no doubt that she would tell people if I let her go. At the time, Bailey and I both had warrants and were living the good life from our criminal activities, and I was willing to do anything to protect that. I strangled Sydney with an extension cord in the bedroom of the apartment here in Wilbur. I have always told the truth when I said Bailey was not in the bedroom when I killed Sydney. Bailey was in the living room when I killed Sydney. All I told Bailey when I went into the bedroom was to stay there. I was going to talk to Sydney. I have always told the truth that the reason I dismembered her body was that I could find no other way to get her out of the apartment without being seen carrying her. Bailey helped me carry Sydney's body from the bedroom into the dining room. I had planned to have her help me in the dismemberment, but she started dry heaving, just carrying Sydney's body, so I did it myself. Bailey and I cleaned up the apartment, and she drove me to Clay County, where I disposed of Sydney's body in an overgrown ditch line. I've done some terrible things in my life, but this is the only thing I have ever done that I feel real regret about. In the past, I could justify myself, but not this time. Sydney did nothing but reject my lifestyle and threaten to expose it, and I killed her for it. I am fully aware that nothing I have said will change a single thing here today, but it is the truth. I am not looking for mercy, forgiveness, or anything else. To be quite frank, and with no disrespect intended to the court, I could care less what you do to me here today. Thank you, Your Honor.
What do you think about what you just heard? In one way, if this is the truth, which I don't think it is, regardless, he was sentenced to death. In November of 2021, it was Bailey's turn to appear before that 3-judge panel for her sentencing. Her attorney described her as a former star athlete who had suffered verbal, mental, and sexual violence and had been trafficked at one point. They argued that these experiences combined with her relationship with Aubrey, this toxic relationship where he was basically manipulating her, this older con man, led to her involvement. A psychologist even testified that Bailey was suffering from PTSD and depression, and that influenced her judgment. Bailey expressed remorse. She pleaded for her life. She was crying in the courtroom. I can't feel bad for these people because it's like you knew what you were doing. But she even mentioned she had a 7-year-old daughter. Nebraska had no provisions for housing a female death row inmate. So in the end, the judges sentenced Bailey to life without the possibility of parole. And I think that probably was the right sentence. I think she clearly helped Aubrey. I mean, she went on those dates with Sydney. She lured her to her death. But I do kind of think there could have been some way she was manipulated, but you let me know what you think. I could be wrong. Aubrey Trail is currently on Nebraska's death row, and Nebraska's last execution was back in 2018. None of the state's current death row cases, including Aubrey's, are close to having an execution date. Aubrey has access to a tablet. Yes, many prisoners do. And he created a Write a Prisoner profile despite the severity of his crime. And in this profile, he describes himself physically. He talks about having recovered from a stroke and mentions enjoying painting, poetry, and old movies. Who cares, I wondered. But of course, he's inviting people to correspond with him, encouraging them to write him, email him, or even call him. I think many people find it troubling that a convicted murderer who has been sentenced to death has privileges like a tablet, access to pen pals, allowing a death row inmate who committed such a heinous act to maintain a public presence and even request companionship. It can seem really unfair and even disrespectful to the victim's memory. It really does highlight the disconnection between the severity of his crimes and some freedom that he still gets to exercise behind bars. The Loofe family's loss was deeply felt, not only by those who knew and loved Sydney, but by many who followed her case. Sydney's case serves as a powerful cautionary tale about personal safety, the potential risks of online interactions, and the importance of trust in our communities. It reminds us that behind every profile can lie motives that we cannot see at first glance, and it's vital to remain alert and proactive in ensuring your own well-being. At the same time, her legacy shows that even in the face of unimaginable loss, communities can come together. They can support survivors and inspire future generations. This is not to say that Sydney did anything wrong, because evil people exist. And in the end, it is their fault for what happened to Sydney. That's clear. I can just only imagine how scary it would have been for this girl who just wanted to connect with someone. And that's what makes these stories so sad. Those last moments, the thoughts that must have been going through her mind when she knew that there was no way out of her situation. It is just disturbing that something like this can happen and that people like this exist. But thank you so very much for listening to Sydney's story. And a huge thank you to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video. Don't forget to download June's Journey today at the link below or by scanning the QR code. And thanks again so much for sponsoring this video and making it possible. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.